Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today we are going to do an episode on a great thinker in the Christian faith. Today we're going to talk about Thomas Cranmer. He was requested by some of our Anglican friends all the way last year. I've had several messages that say, "Hey, can you help an Anglican brother out and talk about one of our heroes of the faith here on the show?" And so I thought, hey, let's do it. We are kind of rotating through topics, so let's get this on the list here. And one of the convenient things is that Dr. Keith has taught a class through readings of the writings of Thomas Cranmer, which he's probably sitting over there trying to recall as I've now put him on the spot for an episode.
For a class I taught
10 years ago.
Yeah, a while ago.
But
Perfect.
We're going to go through hopefully the basics. We're going to, as always, suggest some maybe after reading if you want to engage with this further, and just have some good conversation. So thank you for listening. If you're new to the show, we are now doing things episodic. So there's no longer necessary seasons to what's going on, which was a big change for us in 2018. So if you are looking for different types of material, you say, hey, I heard these guys do stuff on like baptism and atonement and justification, stuff like that. We certainly have, and we certainly do. And you can go on to thinkingfellows.com and you can go find the various different topics that we've done, which are, we've done Christian doctrine, we've done Christian apologetics, and then this church history, which is the vein of the episode that we're doing today. And so you can go check out those categories on the Thinking Fellows website. I know some listeners were confused because the old backlog of all the episodes is changed. So now they don't appear in the order that they were published. Now they appear under these categories. So if you're confused and you're looking for some of the early episodes, you're definitely going to want to go under the theology section on the website, where you'll find those older episodes that we did because we started with Christian doctrine. So I hope that maybe answers some questions that I've heard people having out there. Thank you for listening to the show one more time. I know I say that a lot, but it's been great to watch engagement increase with the show and downloads increase, and just seeing all the different places that people are listening. I think I have a map up right now. Let's see. We have people listen. We've had 30 people listen in Russia this month. That's pretty cool. Like 35 people in China, people all over Africa, South Africa, 180 people, things like that, all over the world. Norway, Germany, one person.
Norway and Germany make more sense than Russia.
Yeah, no, they do.
I guess.
Well, we have.
But to our Russian listeners, thank you.
Yeah. Also, the one listener in Iceland. I hope you're still with us. That's pretty cool.
Me too.
Yeah.
One of my goals is to make it to Iceland in the next couple of years. So maybe we can get a beer.
If you're listening, reach out to us. That's pretty cool.
That's where all the CrossFitters are from, the champion CrossFitters. I don't do that stuff, but
I'm sure
they
they don't.
Last names like Thor's daughter, and
that's cool.
They've had a parliament that's met annually in Iceland ever since 9/11 AD.
Wow.
When the Vikings first reached.
That's cool.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Well,
anyway.
That's cool.
Enough of world history and geography. We're going to talk about a great thinker in the Christian faith. So Thomas Cranmer, we're in the Reformation era, right? He's an English reformer. He's around the same time as later in Luther's life, and he's a contemporary of Melanchthon, right?
Yeah.
And he's in England initially during the reign of Henry VIII, who's sort of notorious, right?
Just a bit.
So, so what can we talk about there? So Henry VIII is kind of triggers the English Reformation in a sense, right? Because of his divorce situation. Adam, maybe?
Well, I'd back it up a little bit, and I'd say one of the things that has interested me the most about Thomas Cranmer, if I had to make a correlation, I think I'd say Cranmer is kind of, I think, the English Melanchthon. He's, at the end of the day, he's a humanist, he's a theologian, he's a biblical scholar, he's a master of the languages, he's a prolific author, and he's also the one that is often called on to keep the peace, in much the same way that Melanchthon was. And so to me, there's a lot of similarity there. I mean, he's born around the same time. He's born in 1489. So he's a little bit older than Melanchthon. He dies 3 years before Melanchthon does in 1556. The the thing that's interesting about him is that he and Adam can maybe help with this a little bit too. I get dates and places mixed up more than Adam does. His formal education is at Cambridge, and it's kind of hard because they will, when you read about Cranmer, they'll list some of the college names, and they're the same as college names at Oxford, so it's very easy to get them mixed up. But
And it's the saying was Oxford for burning, Cambridge for learning.
yeah,
Or that's what Protestants used to say.
yeah. Well, and then
That's
it
because of
be-
the legacy of Cranmer being burned in Oxford.
Yeah, that ends up being true in Cranmer's case. But he's educated at Oxford again, same around these same times as Melanchthon is coming up too, and he joins a group of budding theologians or would-be theologians or actual theologians at Cambridge in the 1520s who come together to read Luther's works publicly. And I've heard sort of the tale that I think is apocryphal with White Horse Inn, that these guys came together at the White Horse Inn, and that's why they named the radio show that Rod's on, the White Horse Inn. I don't know how much of that is historical fact, but it is known that these came together. I mean, people like Thomas Cranmer, William Tyndale, Robert Barnes, Thomas Billing, they'd come together, and they were known as the Little Germany in Cambridge, for coming together to read Luther's writings.
You can still go, if you go to Cambridge, you get into the heart of the city by the real big historic colleges, I think, near King's College, I think it is.
He was at
There's
Jesus College.
Yeah, but in that area, King's College is like the huge monstrosity. It's beautiful, but near there's a little alleyway with a little plaque that says something about the historic White Horse Inn in Little Germany or something, if I remember correctly. So it was, they did meet at this White Horse Inn, which was a public house. That building itself is probably not
The
still-
original.
Yeah, so there's... But
There's a lot of White Horse Inns across Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah, I've seen students who
Yeah.
visit, take pictures in front of it from when I was at Concordia and things like that, or one of them, or
Which is derived. That's essentially because much of the earth around that area is chalky. Many times in the hillsides, you'll see sort of etched out of the grass into the chalk horses. And it's white horses, and so
or other things,
body
body parts.
Yeah, yeah.
People take naps on body parts, hoping they'll get pregnant.
Right.
It's sort of
ancient history.
Yeah.
No, it's true. It's even still done today. It's
Yeah,
like,
it
good
is.
luck.
It's crazy.
Oh wow!
But that's, I think, where the name is derived.
Yeah.
So you'd have inns that popped up; they'd be under the White Horse, so it's the White Horse Inn.
Yeah. And meeting there, that is part of this sort of movement, if you will, this humanistic Renaissance movement where people are they're a little dissatisfied with the old sort of scholastic formulations. They're dissatisfied with the inability of the Church of Rome to anchor its theology and its practice in the biblical text. And so it's not just Luther, but it's anything that's available to them that they're going to sit down and start reading, not because they're a bunch of rebels, but because at least outside of Italy, the humanist movement is about getting to the truth of things via the sources, right?
Yeah. So this is we haven't really talked about this on the show. This is I think debated maybe difference between the northern and the southern humanists. Is a good way to say that. Where in Italy, which we might call the southern humanists, it's a art and culture and architectural movement,
the Renaissance,
and they're interested in truth and things like that too.
Absolutely.
But their trajectory is. They reestablish, a couple of them reestablish a Platonic academy to reinvigorate Platonic philosophy and kind of introduce I don't know if they were just doing it for fun or they actually took it seriously, but some of the old Greco-Roman religion makes an appearance. You get some skepticism.
Architecture too comes in through that too.
Oh yeah. You get a little bit of skepticism and even some soft forms of atheism.
Yeah.
People like Machiavelli, complete re-envisioning of politics. Whereas up in the north, it's a little more focused. It's more ecclesiastical. It's done.
Yep, academic pursuit, the return to the sources. A
lot of it happening within the church, particularly and around Christian doctrine.
Greek, Hebrew, Latin, becoming masters of these things. Going to, even when they're studying philosophy or mathematics, going to the source, right?
Yeah.
That makes its way to England very much so. And I guess the only thing I wanted to point out is that oftentimes when the English Reformation is discussed, it's the discussion centers on Henry VIII. Around 1527, begins to get really sick of Catherine of Aragon, and he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. And so 1527, 1528, 1529, this is happening. And because the Pope refuses to grant him a divorce, right, that we often link the English Reformation to this one event, where all of a sudden the Church of England emerges at essentially Henry's fiat, so that people would say, do what he wants, with his wives, essentially. But if we listen to the history, that as early as 1520, you have a group of what would become very seminal theologians meeting to discuss Martin Luther's writings at the White Horse Inn and probably other places. And by 1525, Cranmer becomes one of those, and very well known one of those theologians. It's difficult to say that the only force of the Reformation that was occurring in England centered around Henry VIII's infidelity and desire to have,
because that is the way the story is told, right?
Yeah.
But it's you have this humanist background, but you also have this bigger English background. I mean, John Wycliffe is from England, right. And the whole Lollard movement that emerged in the wake of Wycliffe's death. So England is more. I'm going to use this term carefully, liberal than what's going on the continent in terms of its approach to things. By that I mean open. There is a tradition of dissent,
and they're
it's not rebellious dissent,
though. Right?
Yeah,
so that has a lot to do with it, I would imagine.
Yeah, so the Reformation that came about, while it was, some people call it the Heinrichian Reformation. That it is something. It was sort of a top-down thing, but it's also coming from the bottom, if you will, up from the people, the theologians, and people like Cranmer and others. So it's a much bigger story than just Henry VIII and getting sick of Catherine not being able to produce a male offspring, or maybe she was ugly too.
But in a sense, though, right, like the Lutheran Reformation is verified in our confession by the princes signing on, right? These political leaders signing on. Could the same be said in England too, that you need that formal political kind of dissent as well for a Reformation to happen? That's how these things have been happening.
That's probably a better question for Adam. I think probably the political structure is slightly different in England. I mean, is Henry VIII? He's not one of the electors, right?
No, and because England's isolated. Back to your point, Caleb, they have since the 100 Years' War, from the 14th to the middle of the 15th century. And even before then, they kind of developed. They're not aloof of continental politics, but they always had this in terms of the Church of England. You don't have a Church of England until Henry VIII, but they always saw themselves not under the authority of the Pope, the way, for example, you might find in Germany or France. They always the English Catholic Church before the English Reformation was very much a national church already.
Well, I mean, they're separated by 26 miles of ocean, right? 26 miles, something like that, of ocean. And it's that provides a certain amount of autonomy, and I think probably always had. Yeah. And so the political structure in England is different than in Germany. I mean, in Germany, you essentially have, whether you call them an elector or prince or whatever, you essentially have these local rulers, governors, and some of them are electors, which means that they are part of the group that comes together to elect the Holy Roman Emperor. Some of them aren't.
Germany is just a huge collection of states.
Yeah.
I think there are upwards of 400 of them at certain points. And they're all governed by, a prince, and they had different names, dukes and barons and counts and all these other things. And you have these 7 electors who, in addition to governing their particular territory, come together when the emperor dies to elect the new emperor. And England's out of that. Yeah, England is not part of that so-called Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. They are very autonomous, as you put it. If they do before the Reformation, they are allied, if you will, connected to the papacy in Rome, but it's kind of a nominal connection.
Right.
They do things their way, and that's sort of the English tradition.
Yeah, probably to this day. I mean, if you take Brexit into account and everything, that's sort of, that's sort of been the struggle throughout history with England and the continent. One of the things that's I think is interesting about this story is that Cranmer. I probably get all these dates wrong, so the listeners need to just cut us some slack. But late 1520s, early 1530s, Cranmer becomes involved as a counselor, maybe to Henry, theological advisor to Henry, or is involved at least in that conversation. And if you the closer you get to the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, the more you'll get rumblings among the Lutheran rulers. I'm just going to call them generically rulers, that it might become necessary at some point for there to be a political alliance in order to repel an invasion that might happen from the Holy Roman Emperor if he were to decide to come up with some soldiers and stop the Reformation. And so at that point, you have even Luther's elector at that point urging that conversations maybe be started with Henry VIII regarding whether or not he'd become part of this alliance, which later becomes known as the Smalcaldic League. And Henry is sort of a prime... You'd want him on your side just politically and the force of the troops that he could muster if you could get him. Problem, he can't stand Luther. I mean, he sees Luther as arrogant and bombastic, and he, probably because he's that himself.
You can't have two of those personalities in the same room.
Ultra alpha males in the same room. It's just not going to work. Henry's much more persuaded by the writings of Melanchthon, probably because he's not as bombastic. He's more thought out. It's not, the same personality as his. And by 1532, which is just 2 years after the Diet of Augsburg, the writing of the Augsburg Confession, 1531, the Apology comes out, the Apology to the Augsburg Confession. Thomas Cranmer sets off to make an official visit to Germany. You say Germany, I mean, he's going to Wittenberg if he can, right? Going to visit the Lutheran Reformation throughout those multiple states in what we now call Germany as an official ambassador to the Emperor Charles V. But his job really is to establish some contact, not just with the Lutheran theologians, but with the Lutheran princes too, because there's this outreach has been happening there. I think he comes back. He's very much influenced by Luther. He's very much influenced by Melanchthon. He meets Andreas Osiander. But when he comes back, and even as he starts writing, while you can see a lot of Lutheran influence in his writing, he's not Lutheran. And some would say that the reason that while he was heavily influenced by Melanchthon and Luther, why he sort of had a stronger connection with Osiander is because following Osiander's theology to some degree allowed him to sort of hold on to those Lutheran ideals while still incorporating some of those, you might call them Eastern ideas, Eastern Orthodox type ideas, but really Catholic ideas, including in parts of the Supper. Not really on justification. He's pretty Lutheran on justification as far as I read it. But on some of those areas where...
like liturgy and things like that.
Where the Lutherans are having a harder time sort of finding agreement with the Roman Catholics, he's able to because he really brings on the teaching of justification and is willing to talk about the other things, which is what Melanchthon gets in trouble for too, as he writes the Variatas right after the Augsburg Confession. Right, those are the things, and Melanchthon would say that throughout his life. Listen, on Article 4, I never shifted justification, right? But I'm willing to make some moves on some of the other articles, including like the presence in the supper and that type of thing.
Could we say? Do you think that Cranmer is very much so? If Luther's the theologian, Cranmer's the churchman.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
He's for Luther, it's a sort of zero-sum game, right? For Cranmer, he wants to keep everything intact as possible. That's not to say Luther didn't want that, but in
Well, he
terms
gave
of
up on
focal
that
point.
sooner.
Yeah.
Well, and the situation in England is a little more. It's tumultuous, but it's at times too. Going from Church of England to Roman Catholic or whatever you want to call it, right? From Henry back to Roman Catholicism
Yeah,
under
they
Mary.
switch all the time.
It's going like this, and that's why they call it the middle way. What's going on in England and what they're eventually sort of settle on is this idea of a middle way.
Yeah. Between Protestant and Roman Catholic.
Right, where
That's Queen Elizabeth, Elizabethan settlement, what, 1560s,
60, yeah.
late 60s?
Yeah.
And it's this via media, and it's 39 articles are officially promulgated.
Right.
The Book of Prayer, of Common Prayer, is the official liturgy. Can we call it that?
It is.
And
yeah,
it's in a way it's ingenious because of this. It strikes this middle way where you could, like in the Book of Common Prayer, you could go there and worship in an Anglican service, right? And it leaves things open to. It's not as specific. It leaves certain things that are contentious that might cause rifts or schism
To the reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's a good place to take our break because of Cranmer's involvement there, and we're at our little time here. So we're going to go ahead and take a break, and then we'll probably jump back in to the influence of the Book of Prayer and some of his other work. Alrighty. Hey there, and welcome to our break. Today, I'm going to, instead of talking about an item in our shop, talk about another podcast/radio show that is available to you that is produced by 1517, and that is the You Are Forgiven radio show, which is also available as a podcast. This is very different than the Thinking Fellows. If the Thinking Fellows is like Bible study or like education or being in a classroom, getting suggested readings, this is the theology that we do practically applied, right? Because this is preaching from pulpits to churches that is recorded, and then we collect that audio, we edit it, and we present it for a radio program here in Southern California. That's Dr. Keith, that's KKLA that goes on?
KKLA, yep.
So if you're in the Southern California area, you can maybe pick it up on KKLA. But the other thing you can do is you can get it as a podcast. So it's youareforgiven.org, or you can look it up on your favorite podcasting app. It's called You Are Forgiven Radio. You can do it on the iTunes podcasting app or Overcast or Radio or Podcast Addict, which is the good Android podcasting app that's available out there. And you can listen to good sermons. So if you are kind of in need for hearing Christ crucified for you, if that's something that you've been missing church because you travel or you have work on Sundays or something like that, and you're not getting that in your life, and you really want that after listening to our show and hearing about how essential it is to keep Christ at the center of things and, having the distinction between law and gospel and preaching, well, you can have that delivered to you in podcast form here. So that is You Are Forgiven Radio. Again, I'll link it in the show notes to an area where you can subscribe to that podcast, but you can do it just like you listen to this show by either searching online or in your favorite podcast listening application. All right. Let's head back into the regular topic of our show. We're still talking about Thomas Cranmer, and we had a good kind of transition there right before the break of moving from kind of just the historical background and backdrop and into what is probably his most famous kind of working piece, right, which is the Book of Common Prayer. And we talked about how that's kind of similar as a confession as we can get in the Anglican Church, right?
Well, I mean, Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, when he wrote it, also included 40. Adam and I were just talking about this. 42 articles
Originally, yeah.
of the faith that he wrote as a Protestant expression of faith in England. These were eventually pared down to final acceptance under Elizabeth. That's the 39 articles, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And
just to correct a point I made earlier, I said late 1560s. 1571 is when it's official.
Okay.
But I don't know if that matters. But
well, I'm sure somebody noticed we were wrong when we said it. But I mean, that's an actual. I think you could actually. That's an actual confession.
Of
the
sort,
39
right?
articles, and as Cranmer wrote it in the 42 articles, you can definitely see that. It's funny when I read Cranmer. In any of his theological writings, he's got a little essay on atonement. He's got a little essay. He's got several essays on justification. And I read him. I can hear phrases that I know Melanchthon uses too, very strongly in Cranmer's writing. And he in his life had quite a bit of different, you might call it Lutheran influences, but theological influences from the continent and from people that, if they weren't Lutheran, were sort of flirting with Lutheranism. I mean, he had great influence by Peter Martyr, Martin Bucer, the Polish reformer John Lasky. And so you can hear this in his writing. And towards the end, I assume, Caleb, we'll do sort of a breakdown of books that people can read on him.
I think so. That's a good idea.
Yeah, there's a good selected writings. It might be out of print, but I'm sure you can get it on Amazon for Thomas Cranmer, where you can get some of this stuff. But it's the trajectory of his life is interesting because I believe that most, and again, Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that most of these theological writings that he does that are later accepted and changed or amended a little bit, like 42 articles to 39 articles. Most of these come out under Edward, right?
Mm-hmm. And then they're revoked by Mary.
Which is
and officially promulgated by Elizabeth. Yeah.
Which is then when he's martyred under Mary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
and I guess that highlights one thing is that he was under the rulership of multiple English monarchs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just Henry VIII. So we have Henry VIII, then Edward the Sixth,
Yep.
and then Mary for a short time.
Mm-hmm. And Edward VI was a short time. I think he was 9 when he became king and died when he was 15, something like that.
Yeah, and we say that, and that's a good point because we say that he was 9 and he became king. I mean, that's very young to be king.
So his advisors were really
well, maybe and probably even, but these royals, Elizabeth included, Edward, Henry VIII, they're being trained in the humanist tradition very strongly. At this time, they have ability in the languages. They're being catechized by and instructed and tutored by very well-known humanists. Even Erasmus makes some trips to England and to Cambridge, and is occasionally part of this process. Elizabeth herself was catechized using Melanchthon's Loci Communes. And so it's not too surprising when you think of that to see the influence of the Continental Reformation on English reformers and theologians, to see that when you read, say, the 39 Articles and you read, say, the Augsburg Confession, you might in certain areas see some similarity and hear some of the same phrases, coming across because they're using these things. They're using them as a resource. Now they have to adjust them, especially on areas where originally Henry was more Catholic, even as he's convinced, maybe say on parts of justification, where he's more Catholic, like the supper, or on baptism, or something like that, or on priests and that type of thing. In fact, Cranmer marries at some point, even though he's a priest, and he marries. Doesn't he marry the niece of Osiander's niece? I think so. He marries.
That's right.
I think in the 1520s, after his first wife dies, and so I guess all I'm trying to point out is that there's a direct connection here that keeps going back and forth. So much so that he is one of the people that is seen as a threat under Mary's reign. Because I mean, for our listeners that aren't familiar with it, you have Henry VIII, and for lack of a better phrase, the Church of England starts under Henry VIII. Throughout his reign, there is an attempt, because Henry does some crazy stuff, like he closes down the monasteries and takes those lands.
Iconoclasm.
And takes them into public usage, right? At that point.
Yeah, in fact, I know a historian who had argued that the Henry VIII and the closing down of monasteries put an end to sort of like the classic liberal arts tradition in England.
Yeah.
Latin in particular.
Yeah.
Latin.
Yeah, probably because you have Cambridge and Oxford at that point, but do you have much developed beyond that? Maybe the universities in Scotland.
But I'm talking like more what we might call elementary, middle,
to the students,
high school type education.
Yeah. And so then under Edward, you also have and I think under Edward, even a more Protestant view of things comes in.
Yeah.
I mean, almost.
I mean, he's a boy, so
it's his
what are his convictions? But he's been advised he was a true blue believing Protestant,
Right.
probably very close to Lutheran in theology. Corey Moss makes the point. He's at Hillsdale College. I think we've had him on before with oh boy,
Barnes.
Yeah, Robert Barnes, another early English martyr, who was thoroughly Lutheran, and he makes the point in one of his articles that England was very close to becoming Lutheran, had it not been for like the personality conflict between Henry VIII and Luther, and the conflict that arose, especially after Henry VIII seeks the annulment from Catherine, permission for it from Luther.
Which is funny because I'm going to mess this up, but I mean when Luther is asked to give his advice regarding the divorce of Henry VIII, he's stalwart on it, right? Mm-hmm. And then similar thing happens when he's asked to give advice on the bigamy of Philip of Hesse, and he's not as stalwart,
right?
And there's
although he did say Philip of Hesse, it was like 1520s, right? 1523, 24. That Philip just lived an adulterous life. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, Luther's like, this guy's not even interested in doing the right thing, so he's a little, not to defend it, but a little loose on that. But with Henry VIII, he put his foot down.
He did. And that personality conflict, I mean, if Lutheranism had a chance into the English Reformation, it was ruined by that personality conflict. The other thing that ruined it, and depending on who you talk to, Philip Melanchthon was offered some positions in Henry's court, including a position at the University of Cambridge in the chair of theology, and turned it down twice.
Wouldn't have that been a thing?
Yeah.
If he would have taken
that would have been crazy. Huh?
Well, it depends on who. And Jim Nestigan said multiple times that he turned it down because his astrology told him that he would die crossing the great ocean.
That does not surprise me.
It wouldn't surprise me either. But what I've read multiple times is that he turned it down because John the Steadfast said,
"You can't leave.
You can't leave. You can't leave." So, maybe a combination of things. Maybe take a little bit of both of those. And
it's much more complicated than just personality issues.
I'm not going to be able to tell you without looking it up the exact year that he's martyred, but the story of his martyrdom is kind of interesting. I mean,
1556 in Oxford.
And I knew that because that's the year he dies. Most of these martyrs were asked to sign a recantation at some point, in which point they were still going to die, but their death would be fast, right? Mm-hmm. If they didn't, they would be burned at the stake.
As a heretic, right?
As a heretic, which I can't even imagine. And originally Cranmer signs it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ridley and Latimer don't. They're burned first. And I think he watches them.
They put him in the tower.
That's right, the tower, Carfax Tower.
Yep.
In Oxford, and
he looks down on the street on what's that street that Blackwell's is on?
Broad Street.
Broad Street. Yeah. And he looks down and sees it.
Yeah, and then I think it was a day or a few days afterwards. He's brought to the fire, and he puts his hand in it initially a couple times and yells out something like, "My hand has caused me to sin," or something like that.
He's going to burn the part that first caused him to sin, caused him to sin the most. I mean, who knows if that story is true, but holy cow. I mean, just think of the courage of and the faith of a man who actually takes back his recantation because he's seen his friends and colleagues burning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That for most of us, that would cause us to go ahead and recant because we don't want to do that. But he sees them.
And that's the whole point with burning people at the stake, is to send a message to any would-be heretics. This is what happens to you if you're a heretic, and it's going to happen to you. That's what you're going to endure for the rest of eternity, in hell, right? And he's still. Some people think of Cranmer as kind of a chicken when he signs the recantation, but actually he was a man of conviction after all.
Yeah, I mean, it's his last sermon, right, before he's burned, where he finally says, he pulls a Luther and Melanchthon and says he rejects the Pope as the Antichrist.
Yep,
and then
sure does.
They rip him out of the pulpit and they burn him.
Yeah, it's crazy, man. The courage of these people. And to say that he's a coward, I mean, I don't know who could ever say that. I mean, you would have to think so highly of yourself to say that. To be in the shoes of these men...
Yeah.
You're facing being burned at the stake.
For believing the wrong thing about a minor
Yeah.
point of doctrine, or maybe
Right.
a major point of doctrine, but yeah.
It's just crazy.
Very different world back then.
Very different world. And I don't think anybody that wrote on behalf of the gospel and justification and preached on it as much as Cranmer did can be called a coward. even when signing. I mean, it's just ridiculous. We face nothing like most of us face nothing like that, and never will in our lives. And get pretty.
And he didn't. Some people might compare him to Luther and Luther's whole "Here I stand" when he's asked to recant, but Luther had protections.
Well, I'm not sure Luther knew that he had protections in 1521. I'm not sure he knew he was going to make it out of that. Okay, in fact, he took a day because he was very.
Because he thought he was.
I think he took a nap too.
Yeah.
Like he said, I got to sleep on this.
Yeah. I mean, he was pretty stressed out about it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure for a long time, even in Germany, and they didn't, right? So by 1548, they don't have protection, even in Luther's lands. Luther's dead in 1546, but they don't. I mean, these men, they put, even if you take the princes who signed the Augsburg Confession, they not only put their name on the line, they put their lands on the line, they put their position on the line, they put their reputation on the line, and they put on the line the lives of those people that God had placed into their care, too. And this is no small thing. And the same thing is going on with these English theologians. And look at, Henry, Edward, and then by the time Edward dies, Mary comes in. And she's just, she's called Bloody Mary for a reason, right?
Yep.
Although I think some would argue that Elizabeth killed more Catholics than Mary killed Protestants.
Mary didn't rule for that long, so she didn't have the opportunity to kill as many. But it is a humbling thing. You were at Oxford for some time, several summers or something like that, right? And I don't know what route you took, but I lived in the northern parts of Oxford, and I'd walk in because it was too cheap to take the bus and couldn't afford a bike. I'd walk in and turn a left on Broad Street, and almost every day I'd walk right past the little cross that marks in the cobblestone.
Yep.
It's all been paved over except for that one spot.
Yep.
There's the sign of the cross, and you just stand there for
pictures
a second.
of it. We can put it in show notes.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
You can stand there. Balliol College is there, where John Wycliffe used to teach, and I think Wycliffe was there for a while, maybe. Cranmer,
Right there.
Carfax Tower, there. The church, the university church, just around the corner. John Duns Scotus is entombed there. I mean, just incredible, that history. And you think, when you walk by it, like where Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer were burned, you think, what a different world it would have been. Where your religious beliefs, like points of doctrine, you might agree on all sorts of other things.
Right. That Jesus Christ is Lord, that God is triune.
Yeah. But you might believe in royal supremacy, right? That the king is over the church, not the pope. And that could get you burned. Or you believe that the Bible and the Bible alone is the source of doctrine that's binding on the conscience of a Christian. And that can get you burned. Very different world.
Very different world.
And these men, and we might add, there were women as well. There's my social justice point. Who put their lives on the line and actually did really change the world for the better. We wouldn't have the world we live in today, in some respects, had these people not stood up.
Absolutely.
Challenged the status quo.
I mean, absolutely. So.
All right, let's close up the show. We said we'd talk about some books, maybe, right, available on Amazon. So definitely the Book of Common Prayer, right, should be added to the list.
Absolutely.
That one.
I mean, a lot of it you'll be reading.
It's liturgy, right?
Liturgics, but I mean, 39 articles for sure.
Yeah,
42 articles.
And it comes together, I think, when you put it on, when you get it on Amazon. So I'll include that, and I might try to. I bet there's a link to maybe some early editions of the Book of Common Prayer for free, similar to the Book of Concord, right?
Probably not as developed as that. That Book of Concord site's pretty well developed.
Yeah, that they deserve some props over there.
Yeah.
What else should we add to the list? What else should we add?
You're gonna have Bromley's Thomas Cranmer, theologian.
Okay.
Oxford University Press. You're going to have Dermot McCulloch's Thomas Cranmer, A Life. It's a tome, but it's a great read. It's a great book. I would have done better at this episode if it hadn't been 10 years ago when I read it. Of course, the Book of Common Prayer will be part of that for you. 39 articles, you mentioned that. the G.E. Duffield is the work of Thomas Cranmer. That's where you're going to, if you can find it, that's where you'll get some primary source material from Tom. Although Macaulay brings quite a bit in the form of like block quotes and things like that. You got any more, Adam, that you'd recommend? I mean, that's just what we did in the readings class. Some of if on Amazon, a lot will come up that I'm not as familiar with. The Dermot McCulloch one is, I think, probably the one that's the standard in a sense. Ashley. I'm gonna forget the name. Just did a new one and has been out lecturing on it quite a bit. I'll find that and get it in the show notes. Paul Zoll, our friend Paul Zoll from over at Mockingbird, did the Collects of Thomas Cranmer. That's worth looking at.
Yeah, that McCulloch biography is just.
It's not Ashley. It's Leslie. Leslie Winfield Williams. That's what it is.
A
Short Life of
the
Thomas
McCulloch
Cranmer.
one is $5 on Amazon. And,
Really?
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty available. For those
he won
listeners.
tons of awards for that.
Oh, it's
And,
excellent.
I mean, obviously he's an outstanding historian, but the way he writes, he has that sort of
He does.
British
Straightforward.
ability to write straightforward, clear,
Not a lot of
lucid
fluff.
English. Yeah.
Well, great, guys. I think this was a good episode. I hope that the listeners who had been wanting us to do this for probably close to a year, I hope this episode was what you wanted us to cover.
I'm sorry if we didn't do it as much justice as they would have hoped. We're not Anglican ourselves, so
It's true, but we've
It's a broad church. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and we've been trying to, when we do these great thinkers, been trying to do as many non-Lutherans as possible, right? Because we have to say there have been great thinkers and contributors to the faith along outside of our own tradition, and this is one of them. So I enjoyed this episode. It was a great time. Thank you for listening. Catch us next week. We're gonna do. We'll rotate into a different topic. I think apologetics, or maybe back to theology.
Can I give one correction?
The
one I'm thinking of is actually Ashley Knoll. It's Thomas Cranmer Doctrine. Just look up at Ashley Knoll, Thomas Cranmer. You're going to see quite a few things. Premier scholar on Cranmer. I have not read a lot of it, but there's been. I have read the book on repentance, and there's been lecturing on the newer books that I think you can find on YouTube too.
Fantastic. All right, we'll catch you next week.